it was at least the most extreme, shocking, and exceptionally serious crime.
It's one of the most brutal crimes we've ever talked about here on Sidebar. A teenager will likely spend the rest of his life in a UK prison after he viciously stabbed 3 little girls to death during a Taylor Swift-themed dance class. The judge told the emotional people in the courtroom during his sentencing that it was the acts of brave adults and children that kept the slaughter from being even worse. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Axel Rudakubana, now 18 years old, was just 17 when he took a taxi to a shopping center in Southport, north of Liverpool, with a large kitchen knife in tow. And police say he went into a dance studio where 26 young girls were taking part in a dance class inspired by pop icon Taylor Swift. And that is when Rudakubana went on a frenzied and brutal rampage on July 29th, 2024, stabbing children. 3 girls died. 7-year-old Elsie Stamcombe, 6-year-old BB King, and 9-year-old Alice Da Silva Aguiar lost their lives. 8 other children were injured. 2 adults who tried to intervene in the attack, they had grave wounds. And this attack only stopped when other children were able to get outside and alert people to what was going on. Now, Rudakubana entered a guilty plea on what was supposed to be his first day of trial. He was convicted of 3 counts of murder, 10 counts of attempted murder, possession of a knife in a public place. He was also convicted of production of a biological toxin, which we're going to get into in a moment. But this is a savage, savage crime. And I have to talk about the details of this and whether or not this could have been prevented in any way. So to talk more about what is truly a horrific case, I want to bring back in friend of the show, former CIA and FBI agent Tracy Walder, News Nation contributor. Tracy, thank you so much for coming on. This is just an unimaginable, unspeakable crime. How do you even prevent something like this? How do you even grasp something like this? You know, the idea that somebody would go into a dance studio with children and commit a crime, I don't know what the answer is.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jesse. And, you know, I guess as a mom of a 9-year-old who I just dropped off at a dance studio last night, I think this is something that touches a lot of people. It's obviously devastating. Some of these girls were stabbed over 100 times by Rudakubana. One of the interesting things about him and about this case, quite frankly, is really how British law enforcement, the system failed. He had been in and out of prisons, out of facilities for minors, multiple times, 3 times, actually. His own parents had actually called on him. A teacher had called on him. A classmate had called on him. He brought knives to school, hockey sticks to school, and had tried to attack others in the past. However, because of his age, they kept not keeping him in detention. And that's incredibly frustrating.
I am going to get more into his past in a minute and what he was looking at, because I think that's, you talk about red flags, there seem to be some apparent red flags. But going back to this, so we have Sir Julian Goose, a British High Court judge in Liverpool, sentenced Rudakubana on Thursday. And according to the judge, he had to be removed from the courtroom because he wouldn't stop yelling about feeling sick while the lawyers were speaking.
During this sentence hearing, Axel Rudakubana was determined to disrupt the proceedings so that he would not have to face the victims of his crimes and justice. I was required to have him removed from court, not because that is what he wanted, but he was preventing the hearing from being held in the normal way. Accordingly, I passed sentence in his voluntary absence, whilst his counsel, both leading and junior, and solicitor are present in court.
Judge Goose said Rudakubana had been checked by medical specialists before he came to court, was found to be fit to attend, but he was removed so things could proceed. He then went over the facts of the case and just the horrific injuries that these girls suffered.
It was of such extreme violence, of the utmost and exceptionally high seriousness, that it is difficult to comprehend why it was done. I am sure that Rudakubana had a settled and determined intention to carry out these offences, and that had he been able to, he would have killed each and every child, all 26 of them, as well as any adults who got in his way. It was only because some managed to escape that prevented many more from being murdered.
Yeah, just a really disturbing case here. And look, the stories we cover on Sidebar show that the world can be quite scary, and it's true. And for those of you thinking, how do I even go about protecting myself from all that's out there? Well, I'll tell you what, if you think about protecting your home, I mean, what property is more important than protecting that? I didn't even know this, but apparently, talking about crimes, home title fraud is rampant right now. Yeah, so I met with the people over at Home Title Lock. They're our amazing partner and sponsor. Freaked me out. This is an example of a fraudulent quitclaim deed. So it got filled out with my information, a forged signature, a fake notary seal. Not only could my property just get transferred behind my back, but the scammers, they go after your equity. They take out loans using your home as collateral. They do all this, they disappear, they leave you with a legal and financial nightmare. But that's where Home Title Lock comes in to give you some peace of mind, especially with their triple lock protection that gets you 24/7 monitoring, alerts of any changes, and restoration services at no out-of-pocket cost to you. So to protect your home, you go to HometitleLock.com/sidebar. Make sure to use promo code sidebar because you get a 30-day free trial of their triple lock protection and a free title history report to make sure you aren't already a victim. The sheer number of stab wounds that we're talking about here that these little girls had, it's again, unbelievable. 7-year-old Elsie had 85 sharp force injuries, according to the medical examiner. 6-year-old BB, the youngest victim, had more than 100.
When the police arrived at about 12 noon, they found him standing over the body of BB King and still holding the knife. It was BB who had suffered at least 122 separate knife wounds. He was arrested, taken into custody, and whilst Rudakubana did not say anything in his police interviews, he did make unsolicited comments which are deeply disturbing, including, quote, "I'm glad to see those kids are dead. It makes me happy," close quote. And, quote, "It's a good thing those children are dead," close quote.
Alice had multiple stab wounds as well, but she was able to get out of there, but she collapsed outside. According to the prosecution, 2 window cleaners who were nearby heard the commotion, rushed to the scene to help. One of them did CPR on Alice, but again, as I mentioned, she died later that night at the hospital. Tracy, talk to me about what it's like as a member of law enforcement to respond to a crime scene like this, to investigate a crime like this.
It's really unconscionable, quite frankly, Jesse. I think seeing children in this state is not something that anyone can ever recover from, even law enforcement. I would imagine that they did receive mental health counseling and those kinds of things, rightly so, after they processed a scene like this. Also, the savage nature that you mentioned, stabbing is obviously a very brutal crime. There is a lot of blood associated with that. And so to see that coupled with the young age of these children is obviously very shocking and not something that they will forget.
And by the way, the evidence against him was, like a mountain of evidence, right? Even I believe he had essentially confessed to what he did, right?
Yes, it's my understanding that he did confess to what he did. There was forensic evidence that was found on him. And as you mentioned before, he did enter a guilty plea ultimately. So it does sound like there was a mountain of evidence, but there was other evidence as well that was recovered that I do find disturbing.
Oh, we're going to talk about that in a second. But yeah, there was video evidence as well, kind of tracking what his movements were. But I will tell you this, because Rudakubana was 17 when he committed this crime, UK law prevented Judge Goose from sentencing him to what's called a whole life order, so basically life in prison. Instead, Rudakubana was sentenced to 52 years. And at that point, it'll be up to a parole board to decide if he should be released. But court officials expressed doubt that Rudakubana would ever be released, considering what he did. Now, this attack has spurred conversations about bringing back the death penalty, not surprisingly. I mean, this was abolished in the United Kingdom back in 1998, but, you have to say, if there's ever a crime that might warrant it, this might be it. So what do we know about Axel Rudakubana? Well, this is where Tracy and I were talking about. And Tracy, I want you to stand by for this and hear all of this, because I am curious if more could have been done to prevent this. So according to the New York Times, he is a British citizen who was born in Wales. His parents are reportedly originally from Rwanda. Now, the murders sparked anti-immigration riots around the UK as disinformation spread about Rudakubana. And there are calls for a public inquiry into how this could have happened and why the judge called Rudakubana's obsession with violence and genocide, why that didn't raise serious red flags sooner. What am I talking about? Well, according to UK court officials, at ages 13 and 14, Rudakubana was referred 3 times to a British counterterrorism program called PREVENT. That's because of his online activity. Officials say in 2019, the teen was researching school shootings during class. Then in 2021, he was found to be uploading images of Libyan dictator Muammar el-Gaddafi to his Instagram account. And then he was referred again for researching the London Bridge terror attack. The New York Times reports that each of those referrals was eventually dropped because Rudakubana didn't, quote, meet the threshold for intervention. And while Rudakubana didn't seem to adhere to any specific ideology, the content found on his computer showed he had this fixation on violence. The New York Times reported that material on the teen's computer, quote, included a history of Nazi Germany, reports on violence in modern Sri Lanka, documents about war in Chechnya, a book on clan cleansing in Somalia, academic reports on the Rwandan genocide, and a paper on punishments used on enslaved people on 18th century British plantations. But it appears that at least one of Rudakubana's family members, they were worried that the teen might be planning to do something awful. Police released video from outside Rudakubana's home showing his father speaking with a taxi driver, asking the driver not to take his son anywhere because he was afraid of what he might do. And at the end of the clip, you can see Rudakubana get out of the back seat of the taxi. Tracy, talk to me about what this history tells you about this person, whether these red flags should have been assigned to stop him, or is it limited? You know, particularly if you're dealing with a teen who might be researching these things, you know, arguably it could be for school or an interest. It's a very difficult job trying to predict the future. But at the same point, there seem to be red flags.
I mean, they also found the Al-Qaeda manual and ricin, you know, on him as well, which is, in my opinion, incredibly disturbing. When I was at the CIA, I actually worked with the British quite a bit in counterterrorism and those kinds of things. One thing I will say, although they are very staunch allies of ours, and we should respect the relationship that we have with them, their criminal justice system, in my opinion, is deeply, deeply flawed. And I feel that a lot of individuals in Britain feel the same way about it. Their punishments do not necessarily match the crime, and it's very, very, very difficult to prosecute individuals under certain sets of charges, particularly minors. They are very protective of minors, and rightly so. We need to be, but to a certain extent. Things like this in the United States, in my opinion, would qualify someone for any kind of mental health holds, particularly children. But in the United Kingdom, they don't meet that threshold. In my opinion, Rudakubana was a ticking time bomb. There is no question, to the point that his family obviously felt that he was as well. But again, as you mentioned, he did not meet that threshold to basically be involuntarily committed, if you will, indefinitely. And so that is what is problematic here in the US. If we had a student mentioning anything about a school shooting or researching anything about a school shooting, they would be probably removed from school, expelled, all those kinds of things, maybe even prosecuted. But that's not the case in the UK.
If you're profiling him and you're trying to determine why is he looking at this particular imagery, this particular content, is there a through line?
In my opinion, yes. But the problem is like I said, in the UK, there is a profile that can be developed, and there's no question that this person will ultimately culminate themselves in something incredibly violent. But I don't know that there are measures put in place to deter this individual and to ultimately stop this individual in the UK. Yeah. I just don't see that.
You mentioned something else, that the ricin. So it seems, I think a fair argument would be that Rudakubana was planning violence beyond just the attack at the dance school, because we told you that he was convicted also of producing a biological toxin. That is because investigators found ricin, this deadly chemical, under his bed. By the way, officials say there's enough ricin there to kill, I think, 12,000 people. That might be a fair estimate. How hard is it to make ricin, Tracy?
This is actually right up my alley. I did toxins and poisons at the CIA and the Counterterrorism Center. It's actually extremely easy. You can get all the material online. There's no question how easy it is. What's upsetting to me is I actually have a medal from the British government from stopping a ricin attack in their country about 20 years ago. And to see that this is happening again is very, very upsetting and frustrating to me, to see that there hasn't been this deterrent put in place in terms of being able to buy the sheer volume of castor beans that he would have needed to do this, although you really don't need a lot, to be completely honest with you. It's very upsetting to see that there's not stopgaps in place because they were almost victims of a truly horrendous attack. So I have to be honest, and I know I'm being difficult on them right now. It's just very frustrating to see this as someone who worked this and stopped an attack for the country.
Well, first of all, as always, thank you for the incredible service that you have done. It's, incredible to be thinking about that. And it's scary to think about what we're talking, because as horrific as this crime is, it could have been exponentially worse. I'll mention this also. So investigators, they also found that Rudakubana had downloaded a PDF titled Military Studies in the Jihad Against the Tyrants, the Al-Qaeda Training Manual. So the question is, why wasn't he charged with terrorism? Well, according to the chief constable of Mirrorside Police, since Rudakubana didn't seem to ascribe to any one particular ideology, the case technically didn't qualify. But the Prime Minister said during a news conference that this horrific attack shows that the definitions of the UK's anti-terror laws needs to change. He also noted that we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety. That they were fixated on that extreme violence seemingly for its own sake. Do you agree with him, Tracy?
I could not agree with him more, to be completely honest with you. As I said before, at the CIA, we would almost get frustrated, and the Brits would get frustrated, quite frankly, if a terrorist was in their country, because they knew we couldn't do anything about it, and they would wait for them, to leave their country. So when you have your own intelligence service and your own law enforcement frustrated with the lack of laws in your country, with the lack of strength, I guess, of laws in your country, clearly defining these things and being able to prosecute them properly, your country has a real problem. Look, our country is certainly not perfect, but I do think we have some really strong laws, quite frankly, governing terrorism and being able to prosecute terrorism. The UK, in my opinion, does not, and I'm very glad to see that the Prime Minister recognizes that. I just hope that they make it a priority.
I do too, because it's, I don't even know how to make sense of this. I don't know how the family makes sense of this. Our hearts and our prayers and our thoughts are with them, because, look, this 2-hour dance class had been billed as a Taylor Swift yoga and dance workshop that aimed at girls 6 to 11. I don't know how it gets more innocent than that. But after the attack, Taylor Swift wrote in an Instagram story this: "The loss of life and innocence and the horrendous trauma inflicted on everyone who was there, the families and first responders, these were just little kids at a dance class. I'm at a complete loss for how to even convey my sympathies to these families." But I'll tell you what, Swift met with survivors of the attack and their families. King Charles visited the site of the disaster as well, and the Prince and Princess of Wales, William and Kate, they met with the families of the victims. And I know that the Prime Minister also said that the entire country, their thoughts and prayers are with them as well. Just a really, really horrible case, and hopefully this guy never, ever, ever steps out of prison. Tracy Walder, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And again, thanks so much for all that you do.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.